Can't be talking about something and all of a sudden you hear Solid Snake in the background going, not so tasty.
Not so tasty.
If it was Mortal Kombat, it'd be different. We could put in a whoopsie.
Brought to you by PaintballToTheEnd.com.
Welcome to episode number 14 of the 10-Minute Marks. I am not Jericho! I am Jeff.
And I'm Paul.
And today we'll be discussing the best feuds of the 1980s and the 1990s. I'm going to cover the 1980s since I was around and watching wrestling back then. And no, I'm not old. And Paul here will be discussing the best feuds of the 1990s.
Yep.
And I will turn it over to Paul.
I've got a few feuds to mention before I go into my favorite one. Obviously, when I talked to my friend Mike the other night, he definitely wanted me to mention Undertaker and Kane. At that time, that feud kind of started around the time, it was before the time Brett left, actually. And so after the screw job, as it were, I think the feud helped WWE because it was the one feud that they kept going and the fans really ate it up. And then, of course, they needed something to keep going because fans were preoccupied with the screw job and Brett and Shawn and everything. And I'll get to that here in a second. But that was one feud I wanted to mention because, and it worked on so many levels, and we all know brotherly rivalry feuds work in wrestling, like with Brett and Owen. But, but in any event, obviously in the 90s when it was Vince McMahon and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and WCW, it was the NWO. During that time, the Attitude Era was red hot. I think the Vince and Austin thing, there was only a month-and-a-half period where it was Stone Cold just beating the crap out of Vince McMahon and ended with, I think Stone Cold said Vince screwed Vince at that point. And they had no choice because after the whole screw job, of course...
you pretty much had to turn Vince heel.
Yeah. And of course, they made it to where everyone related to it because Vince was the boss that everyone hates. And who doesn't have a boss that everyone hates, you know? So that was one of the reasons why it was a great feud, and it helped pull WWE back to #1 above WCW.
And I've had a couple polls on a couple different websites, what was the best feud of the 90s, and it's usually that one or Brett and Shawn that are near the top, or NWO and WCW. So,
but obviously the #1 feud, I think, in my opinion, from a objective standpoint, would have to be Brett and Shawn. And you know, I know you probably saw my Brett tribute and his Shawn tribute, but one, they worked really well together, and two, because they kind of hated each other in real life, or at least, you know, backstage, and it kind of filtered into the matches and into the promos, like the Sunny Days thing.
Right.
And or like when Brett was in the wheelchair and he was totally yelling at Shawn. I mean, just going off on him. You could tell Shawn was livid. And that was before Shawn super kicked him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons why people remember that so much, because there was so much heat. I mean, it was crazy. And the whole USA versus Canada thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's wonderful to watch. You go back and watch it and you're like, wow, these crowds are red hot. They were so into it.
And I enjoyed the feud because of the longevity of it. I mean, to me, that's the best feud of the 90s because it covered pretty much the whole span of the 1990s.
Yes.
It was pretty much an 8-year feud from the time the Rockers joined the WWE to the Montreal Screwjob. You know, you had the Rockers versus the Hart Foundation in the early 90s. Then when Shawn broke up with Marty and they went at it for the Intercontinental title, then they moved on to the World title. I mean, it was just, they could take the feud for 20 years if they wanted to.
Oh, yeah.
And it wouldn't get old.
And just on one final note before we cut to the 80s, my favorite feud from a nostalgic standpoint, because when I first started watching wrestling, it was right around the time Shawn won the belt from Brett. And so I was a little bit of a late bloomer in that respect. But when Brett came back, of course, he feuded with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And that was the first time when I was watching wrestling where... because I had watched wrestling before all that stuff, but I didn't watch it on a religious basis. That was the first time I really liked a heel. And that's why I wanted to mention Brett and Austin, because they respected each other, but they made it look like they hated each other so much, beating each other up backstage, and Stone Cold saying, yeah, you got beat up by your own dad, and your old man in your own basement, and little stuff like that really made it work. But
yeah.
I wanted to mention that because I really liked that.
I remember Stone Cold getting on TV and going, pink and black, what's the pink all about there, Brett?
Yeah. And of course, the fans totally changed during that feud. Now, I firmly believe that that's what started the Attitude Era.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. No.
On to the 80s. We're going ass backwards.
Best feuds of the 1980s. I'm going to take this from WrestleMania 1 up until 1990 because I really, I was too young before WrestleMania 1, and there's no real, you could go back and look, but there's no real way to figure out what the hottest rivalry was between 1980 and WrestleMania 1. So I'm just going to go from 1985 up until 1990. And I'm going to mention a few feuds. Hogan-Andre was a classic feud.
Oh, yeah.
I'll always believe that Andre the Giant will be the number one guy to never hold the WWE title that should have.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that a lot of the reason why he never got the title is because who are you going to beat? Who's going to beat him for it? Andre could have held the belt for 10 years and nobody would have beat him for it. Which to me is a good thing, but I guess to Vince McMahon Sr. back then it really wasn't, Yeah. So, whatever. But Hogan-Andre was a classic feud. Flair versus Luger. I remember watching that and reading magazines, and when Luger finally beat Flair, it was like monumental. Yeah. Yay! Luger finally got over on Flair. Yay!
Yep. That
was a classic WCW NWA feud on so many levels. I mean, those two personalities just clash so much.
I know.
You had Hogan versus Piper, which to me was a great feud just because of Piper.
Yeah, Piper made it work.
Piper made it work. But the number one, I'm going to go a little bit out of the box on this one. And I'm going to say the number one feud in the 1980s was Hogan versus Flair. Even though it never happened in the ring, it was just the dream matchup that everybody wanted. It was Tyson versus Ali. It didn't happen at the time in the 80s, but everybody dreamed about it. And those were the two top guys in the industry without a doubt. Flair was like the 10, 11, 12-time champion by the time they met in 1994. I think Bash of the Beach 94, which they have on WWE Classics on Demand right now. I think that's the first time they mentioned that. This first time Hogan and Flair squared off.
Yep.
It really should have happened at WrestleMania 8.
Yeah, I should have.
But it didn't. But that was just, to me, the rivalry. And it was more NWA versus WWE.
Yeah.
F/E.
Yeah.
At the time. And it was the personification of that rivalry between those two organizations. And, I know a lot of people disagree. Well, they never squared off in the ring. It should be Hogan-Piper. But to me, that was all the rave back then. Hogan versus Flair.
It was real in everyone's mind.
Exactly. It was a real rivalry in everyone's mind, even though it wasn't going to happen until 1994. And that's what made it great. And, that's one thing that's missing out of today's wrestling is the element of what if.
Yeah.
Nowadays fans are more like, we want to get that satisfaction of this will happen. Instead of, 20 years ago it was, what if this would happen? What if Hogan and Flair squared off? What if Flair and Andre? What if Flair and Piper?
Yeah.
So forth. Flair and Savage. What if? But nowadays, you've got to satisfy that curiosity. And to me, sometimes that's not the way to go. Sometimes you want to leave that element of, I want to say element of surprise, but it wasn't really surprise. Just that element of
curiosity.
Curiosity. Yeah, that curiosity going. And keep that fuel in the fire.
Yeah.
So
make the fans want it even more.
Exactly. And it was hot by the time it happened. I mean, I've got Bash of the Beach on DVD now from '94, and that crowd was hot.
Yeah, it was.
It was ready for it. And that's something that you don't get nowadays. You don't get rivalries brewing over 8 years before the actual match happens.
Yeah.
Like you did back then. So that's why that's my best feud in the 1980s. There were some great ones in the 80s. But nothing to me topped that one in that element of curiosity.
And I believe that's all we have for this episode. We got another one coming up. Stay tuned. Leave your questions, comments, opinions, whatever, down there, or email us at 10minutemarks@yahoo.com. We're also on Twitter. And on that note, I do believe that we are done!
Jericho! Jericho!
Not so tasty.